going to try to get through. I suspect there may be some conversation that's generated at the end of all of this, and so I'll try to get through things. And there's going to be some details I'm going to skip necessarily, mostly because I'm trying to get to some points at the end that I'm mostly interested in. But as ever, it takes a village. Person who's done most of the recent analyses, at least, is Luke Benz, one of my PhD students, but then there are a bunch of folks that I've been working with over the years at various institutions. It's a very specific context, but ultimately I think there are points I'm trying to make that are beyond this context, but just to give you a flavor. I moved to Harvard about 14 years ago, and before that I was at a research institute, the Kaiser Permanente Washington Research Institute. It wasn't called that back then. And one of my closest collaborators is this guy, David Arterburn, who's an obesity researcher, does a lot of other things. And we had a series of studies looking at bariatric surgery. Folks may know that bariatric surgery is essentially weight loss surgery. There are three main procedures that folks use, with some variations, like there's laparoscopic variations, but generally they vary in their invasiveness and how much sort of stuff is removed intuitively and in their effectiveness and for a variety of outcomes. It's a huge marketplace for bariatric surgery. And so from an evidentiary perspective, when you compare it to no surgery, there's substantial evidence in terms of benefit across a range of outcomes. There were early trials that focused on short-term outcomes, limited set of outcomes in relatively narrowly defined populations, as you might expect with randomized trials. And then there's been a whole swath of subsequent observational work that considers a much broader range of outcomes that you couldn't reasonably assess in a trial, and certainly in more diverse populations than we typically see in trials. So you can have a look. There are numerous systematic reviews out there, meta-analyses, lots and lots of stuff that's out there. Recently, a couple of the main surgical societies, there's the American one, and I forget the acronyms, unfortunately, and then an international one, changed their guidelines from some initial guidelines that the NIH had convened a consensus statement towards in 1991, essentially saying that they recommended, of course these are surgeons recommending this, but regardless of presence or absence of or severity of obesity-related conditions. So if you have a BMI of at least 35, that's the recommendation. Part of that evidence base comes from a series of papers, studies that I worked on, an umbrella label for which was Durable. It was a couple of R01s actually that funded this work for integrated healthcare systems. For folks who don't know an integrated healthcare system, you get your insurance and your healthcare through the same entity, for better or worse, it seems. Kaiser, 3 institutions at Kaiser, and then Health Partners in Minnesota. So at the time, the data extraction between surgical procedures between 2005 and 2015, about 45,000 surgeries, 1.7 million eligible patients at the time. Again, there's a lot of details, and there are a series of papers that came out from that study, looking at a variety of outcomes. One of those studies was published in JAMA, looking at the association between bariatric surgery and macrovascular outcomes, so stroke and things like that, coronary heart disease. I'm showing you here various inclusion-exclusion criterion, and then the primary outcome was a composite indicator of the first occurrence of coronary artery disease or some cerebrovascular event. The study employed a matched cohort design, and so intuitively you look through this window, and then you say, here are a bunch of cases, folks who underwent bariatric surgery, and for each of those individuals, I know the date on which they underwent bariatric surgery, and I then consider that particular date and ascertain all of the individuals who satisfy the inclusion-exclusion criteria that were primed to the study, but then match the surgical case in on a whole range of characteristics. In a sense, you've got that case, and you're trying to intuitively find their clone in the data. Obviously, they're not quite their clone, but clone in the sense of matching on these covariates. This particular study focused on folks who had type 2 diabetes. So among the 45,000, you do some, there were about 5,300 eligible surgical patients was roughly a 1-to-3 match. Only 38 cases were unable to be matched. So this is sometimes referred to as a matched cohort design. There's a reference if you're interested in finding out a little bit more about it. There's actually newer literature as well. The results, though, seemingly provided an indication that surgery conferred benefit when it came to macrovascular disease. Long story short, can you see the key cursor here? Yeah. In the untreated group, it was roughly 6% incidence of macrovascular disease after 7 years, and it was about half of that in the surgical group. Bear in mind, these are just cumulative incidence. There's no modeling that's based here, but it is partially adjusted in the sense that all of the controls were matched to their respective cases on these covariates. So there's balance, at least, in all of those covariates. Then there were a series of additional regression-based analyses that additionally adjusted for almost everything under the sun in a variety of ways, looking at the sort of risk or sort of differences as characterized by a hazard ratio, again, sort of indicative of benefit for macrovascular disease. Pretty strong hazard ratios by epi-oriented standards, and the paper sort of went on to think about e-values, Tyler's stuff, to query, let's suppose we didn't, there's some residual confounding, residual differences. To what strength would those differences need to manifest, both in terms of their relationships with the outcome and with the exposure simultaneously? What are we missing that has this degree of strength that would overturn the point estimate and the confidence interval? And at least for the point estimates, you'd need relative risks of 2.7. From our perspective, it was implausible that such a single or combined set of covariates would sort of have those characteristics. There were concerns that were raised. A couple of papers came out in the literature. Both papers cited concerns for potential residual confounding. Of course, that's a reasonable concern. And then both papers actually specifically mentioned the Fisher paper, which is why I sort of introduced it. One of the papers argued that there was potential information bias and differential surveillance bias, which seems reasonable. In an electronic health record, if you imagine how data is accrued in that record, it's through a process that is agnostic to the research team, of course, and it requires individuals, lots of people making decisions, and so it's possible. The other paper queried the nature of the hypothetical trial that the Fisher paper, at least, was considering. And so to elaborate a little bit further, they raised the notion that at the time of surgery, like we were using this matched cohort design, and we conceived essentially with the matched cohort design of this sense of like, oh, here are two individuals, one got surgery and one didn't. And they're matched in a whole bunch of covariates, it's not perfect, and then eventually you're going to do some regression adjustment to try to mitigate any further differences. But in that moment, you're sort of thinking, oh, maybe hypothetically there was a flip of the coin and one person got surgery and one person didn't. But in practice, at least, it's reasonable to presuppose that you don't know exactly that you're going to get surgery on the day. There isn't a coin that is flipped. That there's typically a preoperative period. Before you undergo surgery, stuff happens. You prepare for that surgery. And so it would be a sort of realistic target trial would acknowledge that in some capacity, which seems reasonable. And that preoperative period is important because in the observed data, folks undergo, presumably, we don't know exactly, but presumably there is some preoperative period where they were told they're getting surgery and do something, quit smoking, lose some weight. And then the folks who were not undergoing surgery, of course, there's no reason that would have happened to them because we were picking them as matched controls. So there is a sense that there are preoperative differences that are relevant, potentially relevant. Certainly differences between those who got treated and those who got surgery and those who didn't. And then to the extent that the impact of that preoperative period, whatever they went through, has an impact on the outcome, cardiovascular events over 7 years, maybe there's some residual confounding going on there that needs to be mitigated or needs to be resolved somehow. So the solution that was put forward was perhaps to use a target trial to formalize some of this into the design. And folks, I suspect, know that in a nutshell, the target trial framework suggests, tell me what the trial you would have conducted is. We have a table, you've got the target trial, you pre-specify inclusion-exclusion criteria, you pre-specify interventions, follow-up, lots of different things, as you would if you were writing a grant. And then you take whatever data resource you have and you are charged with trying to emulate that particular trial. And then typically the second half of the table sort of describes how you're going to do that, how you're going to operationalize that. It's usually very specific to the data set because not all data sets are created equally, and there's a bunch of detail that you have to figure out, and it's usually a few grains of salt peppered around in there that you have to swallow. And it's intuitively appealing. It's like you're trying to answer a question that could in principle be addressed with a trial. I think it helps, it's important that it helps avoid certain important mistakes. Immortal time bias is one of the big ones. I like that it enhances transparency as to what you're doing and why you're doing it. And then personally, I find that it provides a roadmap that can reduce tinkering. And what I mean by that is, in my early experience as a biostatistician working with folks, we would do an analysis and they'd be like, well, let's just change this a little bit. And then you come back a week later and it's like, let's change this a little bit. And then you come back a week later. And in that, like 2 months later, you've done like 100 analyses and it's infuriating. And so now you pre-specify stuff. And maybe it's not in the context of an emulated trial, but I think that this challenges you to go down that path, challenges you to make decisions up front. And it's been illustrated in a wide range of settings. So specifically where you've got an actual trial, you get some data, you emulate that trial, you get comparable conclusions. That's what I'm meaning here by a successful trial emulation. And this is, there are many, many, many examples. This just happens to be one that was published pretty recently in oncology. Lots of good reason to do a paper trial emulation. So in one of those papers, they put forward a couple of trials that they would conduct. One was to say, okay, everybody in this hypothetical trial has to go through this preoperative period. That's what we would do. That's the protocol that we would specify. And then at the end of that, so everybody is getting the same deal. Everybody loses weight, everybody stops smoking, sorry. And then by forcing everybody to go through that, there's balance. And you mitigate the concerns that there would be around confounding there. And then on the day, in this hypothetical trial, you flip a coin, and there's balance in those preoperative things. You flip a coin, either you get surgery or you don't, and then we follow you moving forward. A different trial would be to flip that coin much earlier, at the beginning. Like, you conceive of an initial discussion that they're going to have. Are you going to have surgery or not? We're going to flip a coin. And then if you are assigned to the quote-unquote intervention group, the intervention becomes not just the surgery, but also the stuff that you do preoperatively. Whereas the folks in the non-intervention group, I don't know, they would just do whatever they want to do. Lots and lots of details here. They use, there's data from the VA that's used to emulate these trials. There are a bunch of challenges. It's non-trivial. The paper puts forward a number of paths to operationalize those challenges. Skipping over the details, I admit, the results sort of are indicative of no evidence of benefit. If you look at the cumulative incidence functions, the analyses are somewhat different because there's a pooled logistic regression underneath the hood that's been standardized, but the blue line is the no surgery group. There is a confidence interval there. It's just much, much tighter because there are far, far, far many more people who did not get surgery than who did get surgery. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But long story short, it doesn't seem like there's any evidence towards benefit, and clearly benefit in terms of BMI and to some extent hemoglobin A1C. But then when you focus on cardiovascular events at year 7, it's a minus point. It's roughly a 1% difference, but the confidence interval is minus 12 to 14, very, very wide. Unclear that you certainly can't conclude from this that there is benefit. So there are a number of conclusions that are drawn. Perhaps that the prior studies were flawed in some sense and introduced bias, and that the primary kind of policy-ish conclusion was that their findings didn't support a bariatric surgery intervention and therefore provided some argument around equipoise for a randomized trial. So intuitively, it's like, here's, bless you, the story isn't complete, and perhaps in a randomized trial, it would be unethical to randomize somebody to an intervention that, bless you, for which there was sort of some evidence of benefit. Or you wouldn't, if there is an intervention for which there is some evidence of benefit, it's not clear that it's ethical to not intervene. The paper was accompanied by a commentary that sort of extolled the benefits of target trial emulations, but possibly went a little bit further to suggest that maybe recommendations around bariatric surgery are misguided. The paper number 1 drew similar conclusions from Optim. They didn't use a target trial framework, but used a combination of exclusion and high-dimensional propensity scores in an effort to mitigate some of those information biases that I talked about earlier, the surveillance biases. So where does this leave us? There's a body of work. There's some relatively new papers that suggest that body of work may not hold. And of course, this would be mitigated if there was a randomized trial floating around. Maybe not all of it. And it turns out that there have been a number of recent trials, small-ish, single-center trials around the US, conducted between 2007 and 2013 with follow-up through 2022. A paper just came out in JAMA, a pooled analyses. The primary outcome for the pooled analyses at least was percent change in hemoglobin A1C. So these are folks who have diabetes from baseline to 7 years. None of the 4 trials, unfortunately, were powered for cardiovascular events, which is kind of the crux of what we've been talking about. There are only 262 patients total across the 4 trials. So unclear, probably unlikely that we're actually going to be able to say anything about cardiovascular outcomes with those studies. The group that led this, folks that I know, actually started doing back-of-the-envelope calculations to say, well, what would it take to do a randomized trial? If there is evidence for equipoise, what would it take? And the long story short, it's never going to get funded. Nobody is ever going to fund a $100 million trial to look at 7-year outcomes, cardiovascular-related outcomes from bariatric surgery. So one way forward is to say, well, can we reconcile the seemingly discrepant results? Can we move forward? So in the absence of an actual trial, again, I don't think that it's ever going to be conducted. What we have endeavored to do then is to take the durable data, and instead of using the matched cohort design that we did use, we mimicked trial number 1. Trial number 1, you may remember, is the trial where everybody undergoes the same thing, the same preoperative period, and then you flip a coin. And we're going to, part of that trial, of course, is pre-specification of inclusion-exclusion criteria. What I'm going to end up showing you are 3 different sets of inclusion-exclusion criteria, and I'll talk a little bit about why I'm doing that later on. The inclusion-exclusion criteria 1 by itself most closely mimics what was done in Fisher, and then if you take 1, 2, and 3 together, that mimics most closely what was going on in the VA trial from paper 1. The outcome, the details of the primary outcome regression analysis are exactly the same as far as we could tell. We constructed some propensity scores for dealing with the confounding. We were unable, unfortunately, to replicate exactly what was done in trial 1 for various reasons, mostly some convergence issues. We attempted to do so, but we had some convergence identifiability issues. So we sort of end up presenting 3 different sets of analyses to sort of different propensity score models that have different degrees of flexibility in different portions. And unfortunately, when you add flexibility in one area, sometimes there's a trade-off that certain components were not estimable, but we'll sort of see what happens. Recalling that the reported estimated event risk difference from trial number 1 in the VA was -1%. This was a confidence interval of -12 to 14%. And then if you take again, we can report now risk ratios and risk differences, just focusing on the risk differences. The baseline risk is quite different in the durable Kaiser Permanente population than it is in the VA population. But the long story short, you take the totality of all of this, it seems to me to suggest that there's benefit. You can take estimates of cumulative incidence. Again, the red ones here are the no surgery group. The blue ones are the surgical group. The blue has a much wider confidence interval because there are many more non-surgical folks than surgical folks. But again, the long story short here is it seems that across a whole range of different sets of inclusion-exclusion criteria, some of which were specifically included to try to mitigate concerns about preoperative differences between the groups. So you could not have lost a certain amount of weight, restricting to non-smokers, that kind of stuff, and then combining with various strategies to do the best that we can to adjust for confounding through propensity score. It's not a high-dimensional propensity score, but actually that's something that we probably could do and think about doing. So where does that leave us? At least for my part, we can leave this open to debate in a minute. My sense is that we've come full circle. The evidence that we have from emulating the target trial in the durable data is such that it seems to be consistent with the perspective that there is benefit in regard to CVD. Moreover, I don't believe that there's an argument of equipoise in relation to a trial. I think it would be difficult to justify a trial given how much it seems like it's going to cost. And I think in sort of coming to this, I think there are a number of pieces of the journey that are worth pausing to reflect on, and that's kind of where I want to spend most of the time. And I think there are implications for us as researchers as we conduct our own studies. One of my roles is I'm a statistical editor at JAMA Network Open, so I spend a lot of time reading a lot of different clinical papers, and one of the things that we spend a heavy amount of time on is trying to decide what standards we're using during the editorial process. Like, when are we comfortable publishing something and when are we not comfortable publishing something? And so in particular then, when we're looking, just taking this as a specific example, like what standards are we using when we consider the nature and the totality of evidence regarding whether or not bariatric surgery is beneficial in relation to CVD? Especially when labels like flawed and misguided are being used, and especially, most importantly, when there is no gold standard, and there never will be, at least the way that we conceive of gold standards. So how do we evaluate and judge papers? And I think there's a lot that can be said. I'm going to focus on 3 sets of observations, but I'm interested to hear what other people think. So the sort of a summary of the various sources of information, the surgical periods across those, and then the number of surgical cases that ended up in the primary analytic data set that informed the conclusions of these papers. And I think probably the most striking thing is it's sort of clear that the resource that was the Kaiser Permanente resource had significantly more information on bariatric surgery. It's orders of magnitude differences in sample size in terms of the number of bariatric cases. And of course, sample size considerations, we all have, I think folks are aware of that from a power and precision perspective. The statistician in me also thinks about the validity of the asymptotic, of the procedures that we're employing. It's usually the case that we're not thinking too hard about what asymptotics means, like how big is sample size? Is sample size large enough? And we have these procedures, and when you read statistical papers, they give you these quote-unquote guarantees, these large sample guarantees of consistency, essentially asymptotic unbiasedness, and normality that provides some justification for the quantification of uncertainty. And my sense is that that question of like, how big does my sample size need to be? I mean, what a terrible question. Just take as much as you can possibly get with the money that you have. So we think about it a lot at the design stage, actually. Like whenever we write grants, we actually forced to because they force us to write power and sample size calculations. I think it's interesting that we may not engage with it as much at the analysis stage. And I think about that a lot as in my editorial role. especially because it's not clear to me, and I don't think there are any rules, there aren't any sort of, I can't tell you the answer to this. This is one of the real big challenges, is that, you know, at what point can we take our statistical guarantees for granted? It's not clear to me. Especially perhaps when we're very, very concerned with other forms of bias that are a bit more conceptual, a bit easier to get a handle on, a bit easier to sort of say, here's a rule and I can apply it. Even if we don't directly engage with that query, we're actually, sometimes we have no choice but to engage with it, even if we don't engage with it conceptually. We were unable to replicate certain portions of the paper one analysis. There were identifiability issues that I'm guessing that if our sample size increased, we wouldn't have those identifiability issues. So to some extent, they come to the fore because we're trying to be super flexible for very good reasons, and sometimes you just don't have the capacity to do that. You know, one of the things about JAMA Network Open is we're very open to studies of rare diseases where you're never going to be in asymptodia. Never. So it's important to think about how we got to that. You know, so in paper one, for example, we started out with about 4,000 cases, and the analyses ended up being based on about 344. And there were very good reasons that if you read the paper, there was sort of very logical sequence of events that got them to that point. But in the end, you're basing your conclusions on about 5%, 10 to 5% of the population. And again, like, there are very specific biases that were of concern that they're working towards mitigating. And the solutions, though, end up in this place where perhaps generalizability has been compromised. Not just with respect to Optum, but certainly the population. So we've got to think about how we got to the place that we are, is I guess the point. The second point then. I think it's intuitively reasonable to acknowledge that the papers at hand are not really considering the same target populations. Especially the VA-based study and the Kaiser's. Optum seems like it would be roughly the same sort of set of demographics. I don't pretend to know Optum as well as these other ones. And you can see some of that, at least, when we compare some demographics that we're able to ascertain from the publications. And long story short is VA population seems to be a bit older, certainly far fewer females in the VA population, slightly not quite as heavy as the durable population, the standard population. I think that's probably not particularly surprising. It's often the case in our editorial meetings that when we get papers from the VA, we're not excluding them. That's certainly not the case, but it is acknowledged that the VA represents a different population than the US population, for example. So a natural question to ask, I think, then is, should we even expect the numerical results to be the same? But all of this could be true. It's not to say that the results that we get in durable represent a standard against which this must be incorrect. It may simply be that there are differences in the population. And how did those differences arise? And the numeric values of, quote unquote, the truth, I think it depends upon differences in patient level characteristics, which I think is intuitive, and we've seen that. And also just whether the true effect varies by those characteristics, you know. If the effect of surgery is a main effect that is agnostic to everything else, then it should be that the overall point estimate is the same. But if not, if surgery works better in some people than others, then I think you would expect differences. Either way, I think that the possibility of differences in the true effect has led to actually a bunch of research. Like, transportability is something that people care about these days. Most of the time, it's taking you know, what we learn from a trial that is often relatively focused, narrowly defined population, and saying, I want to extend my conclusions and see what would happen if I had done this trial in some other population, or maybe a bigger population, or lots of different scenarios. And so it seems to me that, at least from a reconciliation perspective, one way of reconciling the results is to say, well, we're kind of comparing apples and oranges. It's plausible that these are all true simultaneously. A final point. I'm actually a believer in the hypothetical trial framing. I really do think that it's a helpful framing in lots of different ways. It, like I mentioned, forces you to make concrete decisions, which I think is good for lots of different reasons. I don't think that when we make those decisions, what's unclear to me is how we make those decisions. What do we mean when we use the label realistic in, quote unquote, any realistic target trial? The 2 target trials that were put forward by paper 2 incorporated a preoperative period. It seems intuitive from my layman's perspective that folks undergoing surgery would have this preoperative period. Interestingly, like my collaborators that worked on this, and even the trials themselves, none of them incorporated a preoperative component that was akin to the one that was in the 2 that was put forward by paper 2. Seemingly for pragmatic reasons. A little bit of evidence or some data to sort of think about this is among 37 and change thousand folks in the durable data. I said there were 45,000, but some restrictions, again, the details don't really matter that much. But if you look at their preoperative experience of folks who actually underwent bariatric surgery in the KP system, you've got about 5% of them who had increases in BMI of more than 2 kilos per meter squared over the year prior to surgery. And there's an additional 15% who had some increase. So in the observed data, these are people who actually underwent bariatric surgery. Most of them, you can see in the red, were losing weight. But in practice, at least, for better or worse, people are actually undergoing bariatric surgery despite increasing BMI. We have a lot of smokers in our data of folks who seemingly are smokers at the time of surgery. One of the inclusion-exclusion criteria in trial 1 was to remove folks who had concurrent depression or bipolar disorder. If we did that in the durable data, we would lose 45% of the procedure, 45% of the surgical procedures. It's not sort of a judgment on that. It's more, it is reality that people are getting surgery. So what do we think of removing all of these folks? We pre-specify a target trial that suggests, no. We insist on at least a preoperative period, and then we're going to make some exclusion criteria as it relates to comorbid conditions. That's fine. That's a trial. It's not wrong in any sense. What is the right group of individuals to include? In some sense, of course, this is one of those questions that the emulated trial framework forces us to engage in. It's a really, really, really good reason to go down this path. My sense, though, and this is actually another sort of consequence of some of my editorial responsibilities, where we, one of the AEs will be like, hey, this is a randomized trial, we should take it. And I'm like, I don't know, let's read a little bit about this trial and see how good it really is. And most of my opinion about that has come about because I do think that there is a degree of conservatism that comes with trial thinking. There's often a tight focus and interest in efficacy as opposed to effectiveness. Some people may have been too young in this room, but there was comparative effectiveness research was the big acronym, like, I don't even know, 10 years ago or something. We hardly ever see it anymore. But the point was well taken, the difference between effectiveness and efficacy. And it's often on tightly defined populations. There are lots of incentives to tightly control the population to get efficacy, possibly, sometimes, often at the expense of generalizability. So there is the possibility that conservatism that exists in trials, for better or worse, for good reasons and not sometimes, that could creep into our thinking about target trial emulation. If we're forced into a situation to specify a target trial, there's no reason to think that conservatism wouldn't creep into that. And so as we hone in on design decisions that prioritize internal validity, just like design decisions in trials often do, I think there is a risk that we end up with something that has possibly little to no application in the quote-unquote real world. And it's just, again, something that I think about, like in terms of trying to reconcile what's going on. So I'm going to leave with some final thoughts and some questions. In the absence, I don't have any answers to these. I'm not sure that there are answers to these. They're probably just opinions. In the absence of a gold standard, what should we hold up as a gold standard? Is the emulated trial approach the one ring to rule them all and in the darkness bind them? Some of you, I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan. What should we do if my emulated trial design doesn't align with yours? In terms of those decisions that are being made, in terms of the conclusions that are being drawn. Are our gold standards even gold standards? If there is no hope of a target trial, of an actual trial, what do we hold up as a gold standard? Should we even think of a particular framework as being a gold standard? There's a lot of debate on this in the literature, folks, and it's very interesting. Some of it contentious, there's commentaries. My personal sense is no matter what your philosophy, I think we have to be wary of prescription. As somebody who teaches a lot, I'm often asked, well, if I have this, what should I do? And some students that I work with will know that the most frustrating answer is, well, it depends. Unfortunately, there's very seldomly prescription that we can afford, even if people want it. And certainly I don't think that we should be pushing it. And any way forward, I think, has to acknowledge and understand trade-offs. Some of my thinking about this was actually the EPI seminar that Maria gave a few weeks back. I think that there is scope for pragmatism, especially when whatever the quote-unquote truth is likely very, 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 very complicated. And especially when it's often pretty straightforward to take any particular study, including studies that I've worked on, to critique them. It's very straightforward, I think. I like the evidence triangulation framing. I don't pretend to know a lot about it, but it makes intuitive sense to me. I think it has some consistency in philosophy that underpins systematic reviews and meta-analyses. I think in this spirit, I think it might be useful to consider a modification of the well-known adage. Maybe that all analyses are wrong, but collectively some subset may be useful, at least in making decisions when there's no gold standard.